So for lesson 1, we need to first decide where you're going to teach, because this is one of the first decisions you need to make before you ask anyone if they want lessons or start putting out flyers or whatever you're going to do to find your first students. You need to decide where you're going to teach, and you might actually end up teaching in a couple of different places. So, what are some of the options? Well, the most obvious one for most people is where you live. You may have even taken lessons from someone who taught from their home. Depending on a few factors, that's probably a great option. So, one thing that might stop you from teaching in your home is if you have something like a homeowners association or building regulations, or you rent your home where you live and you're not allowed by your landlord to actually work from your house. If that's the case, your home is going to be ruled out. But if that's not the case, you still might want to consider other options. So the downside of teaching out of your home is, well, you never get to go home from work, number one, but also the other people that you live with might be inconvenienced. So if you live alone, this isn't a factor, but if you live with other people, you're going to need to think about whether it's going to work with the rest of the people in the house and their lifestyle and how it's going to fit in. So depending on those factors, you probably already have an instinct of whether it might work for you or not. If you are thinking you can't teach from your home just because it's not fancy enough or something, that's probably not the case. A lot of teachers teach from the corner of their living room in many parts of the world. That's quite a normal practice, and there's really nothing wrong with it. So you don't have to have a dedicated teaching room, although you can. Sometimes there's a spare bedroom going. But even a corner of a living room, if you have a piano and adequate space around it or space for your instrument, then teaching from your home can be a great option. If you cannot teach from your home, the next option you might consider is going to students' homes. So obviously, if you go to students' homes, you don't have to have a teaching space in your home. It doesn't matter where you live, really. You're going to go to their houses to teach. So there's a few factors here you might need to consider. Are you going to be comfortable going into other people's houses? You're going to make sure that you feel okay with that. How are you going to travel between the houses? And how are you going to make that environment really conducive to learning and to a lesson? In terms of traveling between the houses, maybe it's obvious to you. Maybe you have a car and everyone drives where you are. Maybe you have a bike and you're perfectly happy to cycle to different students' homes. No matter how you're going to do your commuting, you need to factor in the cost of that time as well. When you come to set your fees, which is coming up in a later lesson, you need to think about that travel time. Your lessons, what you're charging parents, should be more expensive, and it should pay you something for that travel time. Because in the beginning, and I know this from experience, it's really tempting to just not factor it in because you only have a few students or you have no students yet and you're just getting started and you really just want more students. But you might be surprised how quick your studio fills up. And if you don't have any kind of charge for going between houses or certain mileage charge or different ways to work it out, then you're not being paid for that time. And if there's any kind of traffic, if you live in a city or something like that, or you're traveling long distances, you might be spending 20, 30 minutes, maybe more, between students' houses. You have to be paid for that time because if you were teaching from home, you would be able to teach during that time. So that is a factor. And the other thing I'd like you to consider if you're going to teach in students' homes is to make it really clear what the setup should be at the student's home. So I always do a first meeting with parents before we start lessons. And if the student is going to be taking lessons at home, I go to their home for this meeting. And when I'm at their home, I always ask to see their space where their instrument is or where they envisage having the lessons. If we're talking about piano like we are, for me, then it's normally not very movable. So we need to think carefully about where the piano is and what's around it and whether that's going to work for lessons. So there's normally ways we can work around it, but I do want the parents to think that through because sometimes the piano is in the student's bedroom or in a playroom or the living room, and there's a lot of things around that are distracting. And during the lesson, it's really hard for them to pay attention to us. And they need to be able to get into this mode of, I'm having a lesson now. I'm not just hanging out in my house. you have to imagine they're a 6-year-old, right? I'm not just hanging out in my house, I'm actually having a lesson, and I need to go into that mode, take my teacher seriously. And a lot of issues are caused by that when it comes to behavior and things like that. So if it is in a playroom or their bedroom where they have all their toys or something like that, I will talk to the parents about, okay, we need to make sure those are tidy away, or maybe we cover them over somehow, or maybe we have some kind of solution. Because I know from experience, and you can say you know from experience even if you're relatively new, that is going to be distracting for the student. I use a lot of toys and stuff in my lessons, but there's a difference between that and just hanging out in your house and doing whatever you want because your toys are right there, or your new bike is in the room and you just want to zoom around the house on it, right? So you do need to think about that when it comes to the lessons at home. You also need to think about the kind of transition for students. So when students are having at-home lessons, I always talk to the parents about making sure that directly before the lesson, like 10 minutes before the lesson, they have some kind of a routine so that when the teacher arrives, when you arrive to their house, they're in the right mindset for lessons. So they can't be playing the Xbox or sometimes even doing their homework if that's a really engrossing task for them, or watching TV, something where they are going to feel kind of pulled out of that and then thrown into a lesson. We want to avoid that scenario. Try to have a chat to the parents about what happens directly before and making sure they're ready to go. The ideal is that they just do like a 5-minute practice session before you arrive, because then they're already at the piano, they remember what you were working on last week, they're ready to get going right away. Our next option is online lessons. So many teachers started teaching online for the first time during the pandemic, but it was an option before that, and plenty of teachers were giving online lessons even before the world blew up. It is an option, and it can seem like a great solution if you don't have a space that you can teach from and you don't want to travel to students' homes. It can also seem like it's going to open you up in terms of marketing possibilities, because now you could teach the whole world, right? But the thing is, for students that are willing to take lessons online, they can take lessons from any teacher anywhere in the world. So it's not necessarily going to be easier than it is to market locally. It can actually be a little bit more challenging. I'm not saying that to dissuade you, just to dissuade you from choosing the online option because of the marketing possibility. I think if you're going to be an online teacher, you really need to niche down and decide a specific student that you're marketing towards and how you're going to really deliver fantastic lessons to them. You will likely have to make some other investments as well if you're going to teach online, such as a second camera, a web camera that attaches to your computer so that you can have 2 camera views to switch between for the student, or possibly 3 if you want to go a bit further. You may need to invest in a good microphone or audio interface, so you can look into this a little bit more if you're thinking about being an online teacher. But that is a factor as well. It doesn't have to be a huge startup cost by any means. You don't have to get like a DSLR camera and thing like that. But having some different camera angles and really getting to know online platforms and investigating which is going to be the best fit for you is important. Finally then, you could rent somewhere. So obviously there's going to be a cost to this, but if you can't teach from your home or don't want to, you can't teach at students' homes or don't want to, and you don't want to do online teaching, you're left with looking for a space to rent. The type of space you're going to be able to rent is going to depend so much on where you're based, but you can look into things like schools will sometimes rent out classrooms after hours, or churches often have community spaces attached, or maybe your government has community spaces that they rent out, or you can look at commercial locations such as what would be rented for an office or a shop and see whether they're open to having a music school there. You need to look into what the lease is going to be like and the noise considerations and all of that kind of thing, and I wouldn't recommend going out and trying to soundproof a commercial location as your first endeavor as a teacher, because that is more expensive than you might imagine. But you definitely might be able to find a local place that you can rent and work out some kind of deal that's going to make it affordable for you. You likely will have to charge a little bit more for your lessons, or think very carefully about what the budget is going to be if that's the case. But if it's your only option, absolutely go out there, start investigating, start looking into what options might work for you, what's available in your area, and maybe some connections you may have to people who could cut you a bit of a deal in something like a school or community space. So those are your 4 basic options for location: your home, students' homes, online, rented commercial spaces, hired spaces in schools, that kind of thing. Have a good think about which one or ones is going to be a good fit for you. For instance, for a long time and still now in my studio, we do lessons at students' homes and here at my home. So you definitely can mix and match to make it work for you based on different days or what students' availability is. But think of which ones of these is going to be right for you. Try to make your decision or get close to making a decision before you keep going to the next lesson.